This great Hollywood director is British. He launched his directing career by casting only children in Bugsy Malone. Since then, he's gone on to make some of the best movies in cinema. The controversial Midnight Express, the legendary street dancing Fame, the racially charged Mississippi Burning, which earned an Oscar nomination for Gene Hackman, The Commitments, the soul music sensation which won him a British Academy Award for direction, and of course, Evita, the hit musical opera starring the world-famous Madonna.
Hi, I'm Alan Parker. Welcome to Hollywood's Best Film Directors. At this moment, I'm sitting in my agent's office, which happens to be in Beverly Hills in Los Angeles, California, a long way away from my home in London. I grew up in a working class area, kind of project, I guess you would call it in America, in North London, a place called Islington. And I was kind of lucky, I suppose, in that in those days at age 11, you used to have to take this exam, which is called the 11 plus, and I won a scholarship to what was, in fact, the best school in North London. So, in a way, I suppose that was, kind of a lucky break coming from that kind of background. I loved going to the movies, obviously like any other kid of the time. My mother was a seamstress. She was very clever with her hands. She could make almost anything. My dad, he worked for the electricity board. In fact, when I first went to France to do these kind of interviews like this, the interviewer used to say to me, so what did your dad do? And I would say, well, he's an artist, and he's a painter. And they said, really, how fantastic, modernist, abstract, what sort of painter is he? I said, well, he's kind of abstract in a way. I said, avant-garde almost. I said, because he only paints in one colour. And they said, really, that's fantastic, and your father, the artist, paints in one colour. I said, he paints in grey, yes, because he worked for the electricity board and he painted the railings and all of the electricity equipment. That's what he did. Beginning of the 60s, mid-60s, it was pretty exciting times in London, obviously with regards to music and things were happening, but also other areas of the arts. But the most important thing was that people who came from kind of ordinary backgrounds, suddenly in a very class-conscious country, suddenly we were allowed to be able to do kind of things that once upon a time we were not allowed to do. And the brilliant thing about advertising agencies in those days was that it was very egalitarian. They didn't really ask if you had a degree in this or whatever. You could show them the work you'd done, and I kind of was lucky. I got into one agency, and then very quickly I got into the best agency at the time in London, which was called CDP. But when I started, the main competition I had was Ridley Scott. And if a script said, we see a beautiful girl running in slow motion along a beach in Barbados, then Ridley would get that. And then if it said, we see two rather overweight people sitting in a kitchen in East London, then I got those, The funny thing is about Bugsy Malone is that, actually Francis Coppola once said to me that actually at the very beginning of your career, you do the most original work in a way, because you're kind of so ingenuous, so naive, that it never occurs to you that something might not work. And in a way, so you try things that maybe later, in later life when you know a lot more, when you're more experienced, you kind of would say, no, let's not try that, because you know it might not work. But actually, when you don't know anything, you can kind of do kind of fresh, original things. And in fact, Bugsy Malone was original. We worked on it for a year because I was doing TV commercials at the same time. We prepared it for a whole year before we got the money. Most of the money came from the National Film Board in London, and then we needed an American distributor, so Paramount picked it up for very little money. I was not fazed by it at all, even though if I look back on it, it was an impossibly difficult logistical film to make. But I think it's a combination of naivety in the area of feature films, but extraordinary self-confidence with regards to having directed so many commercials. That was my film school, making commercials. I met Jodie Foster here in Los Angeles, and she said she was very excited about she'd just been chosen to do Marty Scorsese film, which turned out to be Taxi Driver, and I said, well, can we squeeze it in if you could? And I remember she got off the plane from filming Taxi Driver. She looked exactly the same as she did in Taxi Driver, and she arrived to do Bugsy Malone. She was kind of surprised really, because she'd spent her whole career at that point being the really most brilliant, bright kid amongst a lot of adults. suddenly she was around a whole lot of kids, you know, and who were a lot more precocious than she was. And she kind of had a lot of fun doing it, I think, because of all these kids around her. But with regards to her abilities to compare with everyone else, well, I mean, she was quite amazing. I remember one day we did 360 degrees or something, and suddenly the cameraman and I couldn't figure out where her eye line should be. And we were going, should it be? And she went bottom left, age 12. Age 12, she'd done so many more films than I had, that I did say to her then, I said, you know, you could probably direct this film, couldn't you? And then she kind of shyly nodded yes. She was always brilliant. I was asked to do Midnight Express when it was a kind of confluence of different things that had occurred. I had been asked to come to New York. I went to New York to see a stage show of The Wiz, which they wanted me to do as a film. And I went to see the show, and you know, when you have dinner afterwards with the studio executives, and we spent like an hour talking about everything but the show, because I didn't really want to do it. And so the next day I was getting ready to come back to London, and I was walking along Fifth Avenue, and from out the Columbia building, then out the door came a guy called Peter Goober, producer, and he said, I've got this manuscript from a novel, and that was Midnight Express, and the galley proofs of the book. And then David Putnam at the same time went into business with Peter Goober, and David Putnam was an old friend of mine who I'd worked with from a lot in London, so those two things coming together was great. And then they said to me, would you meet with this young writer, he's not got any screen credits or anything, called Oliver Stone. And so Oliver came to London, and in my back office of my commercials company, he was on a typewriter all day long, and writing the screenplay of Midnight Express. And that was an experience, because you know, I don't know that we all got on that well, in fact I think we didn't get on well at all, but he did write a pretty terrific screenplay. Mississippi Burning was it came to me as a script. It was at a period of time when, you know, perhaps I was always making American films. I'm known for being an American director. I'm not American, I'm British, and I don't do European films as such. European films at that time were much more political in you know, with regards to what they had to say, had to really reflect on the world that we live in.
General background action. And Turkey's dead. Turkey's dead.
With Mississippi Burning, you know, it was about racism in America. It was a very important subject, but it was written in such a way that would be perhaps, you know, accessible to a bigger audience, and therefore the studio wanted to make it, you know. And I responded to it because I thought that I could say something about that particular period of time. I was not here in the United States during the civil rights struggle, but it was something that I looked at from a historical point of view, obviously, not someone who was part of it. I could not be, because I was in Britain. But and then I reworked the screenplay in a way that I thought would be more political, that would actually say more about racism in this country, to make it more that than just a detective story, which is probably what the studio had originally embarked upon. But the studio were very good, and they did support me, and I was able to make a film that I think said a great deal about racism in this country. It became a very controversial film, because obviously it couldn't speak for everybody who had different opinions with regards to what that might mean in this country. Particularly, I was this white guy from London making a film speaking for black Americans. I think a lot of black Americans were not pleased about that. The interesting thing about casting movies is that, you know, they are cast in limbo in such a way that, you know, you cast that person who's never worked with that person, and then ultimately they're going to have to work together, and you can only suspect that there will be chemistry. You don't really know until it happens. I think that, you know, I try and do my homework. I try and avoid people who might be difficult, because it's hard enough making a movie without having, you know, histrionic actors on your hands. It's just too hard. And a film isn't made by just the actors, and it's not made by the directors.
Don't forget to talk to one another. A lot of energy and action!
It's made by 100 people, and you really ought to respect how hard that 100 people work. Actors often don't. Almost they are very different regarding their work ethic. And so I tried to work with actors who have a similar work ethic to the people who make the film. And just before I started shooting what became Fame, it was called Hot Lunch at the time, on 42nd Street I went past a pornographic movie theatre, and it said Hot Lunch. It was a pornographic film starring Al Parker. So I got, that's too close. So I thought, well, we're going to have to change the title. So what happened was I actually wrote the shooting script. I spent a lot of time in Connecticut working with all the materials that I'd gathered, working or hanging out with the kids basically. And I turned what was Hot Lunch into Fame, and I called it Fame. Actually, I'd already started to shoot when I came up with the title. But it was a simple title, and it's one that stuck, you know.
Enjoy it, and action.
When I started on Pink Floyd The Wall, I was never really going to direct it. I had mentioned to an executive at EMI, the record company, that perhaps The Wall could be a narrative film. And he said, well, that's really interesting because Roger Waters of Pink Floyd really has the same thought, and would you meet with Roger? And I did meet with Roger, and he lived near me in Richmond, and we got on quite well, and I sort of started to work with him and Gerald Scarfe. Gerald Scarfe had done all the animation for the show, because in the actual theatrical version on stage. So I worked with Roger at Gerald Scarfe's house, where you would meet twice a week. I was helping him write it, and I was probably going to produce Pink Floyd The Wall. And then that's how it started, and it was going to be directed in tandem by my cinematographer, Michael Saracen, who had worked with me on a number of films, and Gerald Scarfe was going to do the animation. And it really wasn't working with the people, and so everybody came to me. Roger and Steve O'Rourke, who was the Pink Floyd manager, and they said, would I direct it? So I said, well, you know, I hadn't intended to. So we kind of started again. And I did direct it. Midnight Express was pretty tough to shoot. First of all, we weren't allowed to go to Turkey for obvious reasons, and I looked at like 6 different countries before I decided on Malta. We found this fantastic old Victorian fort, which we then turned into a prison. Very different to how it was written. It was originally written for the real place, which was Sigmalşiler prison in Istanbul, which is kind of a modern, rather boring prison. Very unpleasant, but rather boring. And so we found ourselves in Malta. It was shot it was a very hot summer, and the whole film was shot in 53 days. And 53 days meant that we would shoot, you know, we certainly shot 6-day weeks, but sometimes we had to do 7-day weeks. So kind of everybody started to get sick and everything after a while, because we were just exhausted. But it's not just working so hard with such long hours, but it was also when you're doing such a violent, dramatic piece, kind of that sucks it out of you as well as all of the filmmakers. So I think it was a pretty tough film, and I think certainly the actors all went a bit crazy, and I think most of the crew.
287, take 1, speed. Action!
I remember on 46th Street where we shot the big Fame number, all the kids dancing on top of the taxis and stuff. The police, we did it over 3 days, and the police closed us down in the end, because every day, as far as the eye can see, was a traffic jam in New York, and we created this whole thing. And it was not easy to do, and you suddenly think, you now know why. In the old days, they used to do all these things on the back lot at MGM, which was a much more sensible way to do it, but we did it in the real place, in the real city, which was kind of hard on ourselves, really. Gene Hackman was like, I don't know that I'd ever worked with such a consummate American actor, in that he understood the film set absolutely perfectly. He would never mess up his performance. I remember saying, Gene, you come in and you pick up and he said, no, I don't do that. I don't pick things up, because he would keep it simple and pure. You had Willem Dafoe, a joy in a totally different way, and he'd come from experimental theatre in New York. This was someone who, you couldn't get rid of him off the film set, because he would want to help the prop men pull a table in the corner, or when you change the set around. So they worked very, very differently, and so you don't really know if those coming from two different worlds like that would actually, you know, combust and make something wonderful, or collide and be awful. And quite frankly, until you say action and cut, you don't really know what you're going to get, and then you cross your fingers that it actually worked. When I did Fame in 1979, Evita was on Broadway, and Robert Stigwood asked me to do Evita then. I remember I'd finished Fame and I went on holiday with my kids and wife in the Caribbean, and I remember getting a phone call from Robert Stigwood saying, Alan, I want to come and talk to you. And I said, oh, I'm on an island in the Caribbean. He said, well, I'm on my yacht. We'll sail towards you, which they did do, and then we had lunch, and then he asked me to do Evita, and I kind of thought, well, I'd just done a film chock-a-block with music, which was Fame. I didn't really want to do another musical, so that was then. And then kind of 20 years went by, and Evita went through so many different directors were going to do it, so many, you know, actresses were going to play Evita. When I came on after the 20 years cycle, the incumbent was actually Michelle Pfeiffer. And Michelle at the time had small children and really didn't want to travel, which happens a lot with actors and actresses. Their private lives come first, which is quite right. So the dilemma I had was, do you have an actress who can sing quite well, which is Michelle, or do you have a singer who can perhaps act it? And so I then got this huge long letter from Madonna saying that she was by far and away the best person to play the part, and it was handwritten and very beautiful letter. And so I met with her and I really quite liked it, and we got on okay, and we did the film. We spent 4.5 months doing the music before we even started the film, and the film was quite grueling. And then, you know, just near towards the end she got pregnant, which was not, it had to be taken into account with how we filmed things. But she was so incredibly professional and so hard-working. Again, for a director, that's a complete joy. I don't know that she was overly nice to people like makeup and hair and costume people, but she was incredibly good with me. And so it was, funnily enough, it was actually a very good experience. Extraordinary thing was to watch De Niro and Mickey together in scenes, because it was not about acting, it was like a prize fight. And you know, one would do a left hook and the other one would do a jab and whatever, and it was watching the two of them together was amazing, actually. And I put 2 cameras on them, which, you know, compromises the lighting sometimes, because I had to, because you never knew how one would provoke the other. I mean, the first thing we did went so far in its improvisation, it bore no resemblance to my screenplay. And I thought, well, I spent a lot of time writing that scene, and I thought it was quite good. And now I reached a stage where they had improvised it so much, it was nothing to do with the story of the film. So you drag them back to being what's written on the page, you know. But that kind of chemical exploration is electric to watch, and that's all you can hope for a director. If something that magical and that electric happens outside of the norm, is really truthfully what you're always hoping to put onto film. Well, on Birdie, I was lucky. I had 2 great actors at the very beginnings of their career, practically, Matthew Modine and Nick Cage. They were very different. You know, Matthew was very, you know, languorous and comfortable with doing his part and did it naturally, and there's a beauty about that. Nick worked on it very hard. He had to really think about it. One of the things that he wanted to do was that, you know, the film is in 2 parts really, but in the half of the film, his face is completely covered in bandages, and he used to keep these bandages on when he went home at night, and because he wanted to forget what his face looked like, which is a very serious thing. He had a number of teeth he got rid of. I don't know whether he had to get rid of them, but it made him feel like his face had collapsed, and he needed that. And I think that he put in so much effort and so much work into the part, because he was that kind of actor, and because I think he was at the beginning of his career, it certainly was no problem for me. I worked very well with him.
Action, Kevin.
You know, if you're a director, the last thing, the most irritating thing is to have an actor who's not really trying very hard. But if someone really is putting their entire heart and soul into something, all my job is to help them and to make an environment where they can be of their best. And I think that, you know, if an actor, some people say, oh, so-and-so's a, you know, pain in the neck because they prepare so much. That's a joy, really, because all you want is an actor to actually, you know, put as much effort into what they do as what we do when we're making the movie. The most enjoyable time I had making a film was a film I made called The Commitments. There was 12 kids in that film, very different to making Fame, where there's 8 kids who I might not have liked, but the 12 kids in The Commitments were a joy to work with because they weren't movie stars. There wasn't a single limousine, there was no trailers and nothing like that. And every day I woke up in the hotel in Dublin thinking, wouldn't it be great to go to work today? And you have to feel good about going to work every day and excited about it.
Round the microphone.
That was the most enjoyable. And to just, because you're playing music and stuff, and just to feel that that's why you wanted to be a film director in the first place. And it can be so rewarding, so encouraging, is why I like it the most as a film. Is it the best film? Not necessarily. I'm very proud of Mississippi Burning because it was a political film made at a time when it was really tough to make political films. I'm proud of, you know, Evita because it's an opera. Who would want to try and do an opera in contemporary times, you know? But we pulled it off because we happened to have the most famous woman in the world at the time in the film, and therefore found a wide audience. But it has a scale and scope and an ambition to be able to tell a story with just opera is quite brave to do. And you know, that's 3, but you know, there are others that could be equally proud of. But you know, all 14 really films. You know, you think, yeah, didn't come out too badly. You know, my mentor was Fred Zinnemann, and I remember he saw Birdie, which he really loved, and then immediately afterwards I did Angel Heart, which he didn't like. And I used to show him my films, and Fred used to say to him, give me advice, and Fred saw Angel Heart and he thought was overtly commercial and that it didn't really say as much as it ought to say. And he said, you know, being a film director is a really great, is a privilege, and you shouldn't really squander it on just making movies. Now we have an entire industry which is just about making movies, so it almost sounds very dumb and hollow now, because there was a time when films told stories and actually made you think, and they were about thought, and they were about politics, and they were about the way in which we live our lives, the way in which people behave with one another, and they're not anymore. And an entire audience has grown up not knowing that kind of cinema. And it was a cinema that I believed in, and a cinema that have always and still do try to fight for, which is that films could be serious and dramatic, but have some kind of scale, and have the artistry that cinema can, you know, bring to telling stories.
And cut! Very good. Very nice. Very nice. Thank you very much, Kevin.
I suppose we're judged by the films that we make, individual films. Other people say that you perhaps should be judged by the work, the body of work. And I've tried to make films with certain principles involved with regards to why I make those films. And sometimes they succeed, sometimes they don't. And sometimes you find an audience and sometimes you don't. But they've all been made for the right reason. And also I've been really, really blessed of making a film during the last 30-odd years, a period of time when directors were allowed to make the film that they wanted to make. And I can't blame anybody for the films. I've made 14 films, and they're pretty well almost exactly the films that I wanted to make. And I have absolutely no complaints about studios, distributors, actors, whatever. I actually, in the end, pinch myself that I've been so lucky to do it.
Action.
For all of you people out there who happen to like, you know, Alan Parker films, for a start, I'm incredibly grateful. And it's just very rewarding that you do, actually, because I put a lot of effort into making them. It's just so nice to know that there must be, you know, some of you out there who enjoy them. So thank you very much.
And cut. Very good.